turn it over to the city manager and the finance director.
Thank you, Mayor Whitney. We're excited to present the FY22 and FY23 operating budget for the city of Soldotna and all of its funds. This is a process that's outlined in our Soldotna Municipal Code and includes our projections for revenues and expenditures for the upcoming 2 fiscal years. In the big picture, it allows us to present you with a document about how priorities will be addressed through the services and operations of the city. As the legislative body that sets priorities, this is the document that really kind of captures all of that, that policy work. And then on a much more detailed level, it tells you a lot of information about how we, the staff, plan to do it physically every day with materials and supplies and public resources, including staff. After a pretty interesting year, it's very rewarding to give you a very normal budget. And in fact, when Melanie and I were going through this earlier today, there are some places where there's not a lot to tell you because it's pretty standard with what we've traditionally done. I think that's okay because we are coming out of a fairly abnormal year. And I did use the words weird and blip, and the Clarion put that in the quote. What I meant by that was it's really an outlier. This budget that we are in right now, the fiscal year we're in right now, because of the tremendous amount of uncertainty when we were preparing that document last May and June, it really is going to stand out in our history as being a bit different. This year is a budget that returns us to, I think, kind of normal budgeting, normal operations, and we're glad to get back to that. I want to thank the staff. Many of our department heads are here with us tonight, and you'll have an opportunity to ask them individual questions as we go through their department budgets. They put a lot of work into this document because for the first time we're presenting 2 years worth of requested expenditures. And so that took some additional work. This is a process that starts in January or early February of every year, and we really spend several months putting this document together to be able to present it to you. And then I want to thank Melanie because it's a lot of work under normal circumstances, but as this was the first time we were doing this biennial budget, everything had to be redone. So the document is new. All of the spreadsheets and formulas that support the document had to be redone, and Melanie put in a lot of work over the last several months to make that happen. So thank you for that. The schedule is we're going to go through today the big picture overview, and Melanie and I will present kind of some big picture takeaways and cover the high level information from the budget. Then we're going to walk through each of the departments in the general fund. So we'll go through the document until we get to that non-departmental fund at the end of the general fund, and at that point we will stop. So we'll be able to go through all the general fund departments today, and then we'll resume tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and we'll pick up right where we left off. We'll start at that non-departmental portion with the 4 nonprofits being able to present to you directly. After that, we'll move through the other funds in the document, including utilities, airport, street assessment, equipment replacement, etc. So that's the plan. Any questions or comments before we dive in? And I would say interrupt us at will. Okay. Before I get to some of the numbers, I want to just highlight a few things that are new to the document this year. One of them obviously being it's got 2 upcoming fiscal years, and so there's an additional column of expenditures for FY23. So we've got the FY22 request as well as the FY23, and you'll notice that as an additional column throughout the document. We have added an extra column of actual expenditures. So there's more context in comparing this budget to prior years. So now you can look at pages and you will have 2 full years of actual expenditures as well as the current year we're in that was budgeted, as well as the 2 budgets moving forward. So again, this is just giving you and the public really more information, more context about how these budgets fit into what we have done in the past. We added more detailed notes at the end of each department. And so this is the similar information that Melanie and I would cover and the department heads would highlight as we go through the document. Now you'll notice when we go through each department at the very end, there's a box at the bottom that has some notes on different accounts and some of the specific dollar impacts, projects, material supplies. We were adding that to the document. I think it provides better information, and also looking back, it'll provide better clarity in kind of what some of those changes were from year to year. So that's something that's new. And the last is we added staff allocation matrices at the beginning of each department. And we can go into this in a bit more detail as we go through the departments, but the city has, as a standard practice, we allocate a portion of some employees' times to different departments. That's particularly important if we've got non-general fund departments like the airport or utilities that are using general fund resources, such as people. We allocate a portion of those people's salary to those departments so that, for example, the airport, which has 0 employees on its own, it actually has quite a bit of folks who contribute a portion of their time. We've done that. That's not a new practice, but it's new that we're showing you in the budget book for the first time, so that when we go through those departments, you'll be able to see whose time is allocated to this department and this salary line. And anything else, Melanie? She loves it when I talk all the time, but she's going to talk a lot tonight. These changes align with our goals of better transparency in budgeting, and I'm really proud of this document. Let's get started. Let's talk about, oh, go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
I do have one quick question. On those allocations of the time that an employee spends working for another department, I guess you call it, is that actually reflected in that other department's budget as a salary?
Correct. So if we use airport as an example, we have 0 staff that are dedicated to the airport, but there is a salary component of the airport's budget because it includes, for example, a portion of Kyle's time as the airport manager, a lot of time from Scotty's department that does snow plowing and maintenance. So there are salary costs associated with that department, and we're now showing you who contributes to make up those salary costs. We're good. Oh, yes.
Will we find, and looking at this 2 years of budget, will we find deferred maintenance, or is the city able to keep up on a, I'm going to say, timely, with all the maintenance that needs to be done in the department?
Thank you, Mr. Carey. I would say yes, we are on top of maintenance, whether it's, infrastructure, streets, utilities, parks. We're adding a lot of amenities that need to be maintained. And this operating budget reflects maintaining our assets at a high level. And the capital budget, which is separate, which will come shortly to the council, that would address any major maintenance needs. But in terms of day-to-day operations, I feel confident that this budget keeps us on top of the needs of our infrastructure. Thank you. I'd like to start by talking about all funds combined, and let's flip to page VIII. These are in the intro pages. What we're going to cover in this overview is a lot of the information that's in the transmittal letter itself, but rather than go through the transmittal letter, Melanie and I are going to reference you to certain pages in the document that highlight the same information. Page VIII is the page that gives the big picture overview of all funds combined. This is the general fund combined with airport, utility, street assessment, et cetera, and shows you the revenues broken out by type, expenditures, and as well as the projected lapse. The projected lapse, as we know, though we try to budget conservatively, typically the city doesn't spend all the expenditures in any given year. That we recognize that, we build in a lapse so that when we tell the council, here's what we anticipate the change in fund balance will be, it's more accurate and reflective of our actual assumptions about where we'll end up at the end of the year. And this page shows you those revenues less expenditures with what we believe will be expenditures that are not spent, and the overall projected change in fund balance. Melanie, do you want to add any comments?
Did you want to talk at all about lapses over the years?
Sure, if you could give maybe a little bit of context to that.
Sure. So in addition to lapses of expenditures, we also have generally more revenues that we receive than what's budgeted, because we generally budget conservatively for revenues as well. So the difference, the change in fund balance is not only going to be the lapse of expenditures, but also more revenue that we've brought in. So while sometimes we'll show, well, many times we'll show in the general fund a deficit, that's not actually going to be the case. At the end of the year, for operations, we'll have a surplus.
And we've got, let's see, again, because of the challenge with comparing this budget to last year's budget was reduced so significantly in terms of both revenue and expenditures. You'll see on this page that for just looking at revenues, it's showing a one-year difference of 25%. That is important because, remember, last year, the year we're in, was a very different budget that we built. If you're looking at revenues, for example, compared to 2 years ago, we're up about 2%. So our revenues in general are, we think now, in the current year we're in, going to be pretty close to last year's revenue. We projected a 20% decrease. We now believe we will be almost flat with last year in terms of revenue for the city. The places we were correct is that we knew that facility rental fees would be down for the sports center example. Big events were canceled. A lot of things didn't happen. So those were down. Places where our assumptions turned out to be incorrect, one was sales tax. Sales tax for the city on a whole, we believe, will be on par with prior years. Property tax, we had budgeted lower, believing that we may have some collections issues, lower compliance, but it turned out not to be the case. So we think our property taxes are going to be pretty much flat. And then fees for services, not a big significant change there.
And investment earnings is another one, like we talked about at the last work session. Investment earnings were quite a bit more than we had anticipated.
Question? Would you anticipate, by the time we are actually approving a budget, will we have the more up-to-date numbers? Or are those numbers something that won't be available till later on?
So currently for sales tax, we have 2 quarters, the first half of the year. The third quarter we generally receive in May. So it's about 2 months after the end of the quarter. So we should have third quarter numbers this month. We just don't have them yet. So we'll have more current numbers. We won't have final numbers, of course.
So
And
really,
part of my concern is, I heard consistently that the budget was lower in terms of anticipating. Will our final budget then be pretty close on those things that we budgeted lower, but in fact, they're much higher?
no, because we will not receive better information until well into next fiscal year. But really, we wanted to point this out to show that Soldotna, though we've got a change in fund balance, a deficit on paper of about $445,000, that's fairly normal in how we build our budget. And in reality, with the conservative assumptions built in, we project that there will be a surplus available at the end of the year to be used for capital projects. A surplus prior to pulling it out for capital. And pointing out in the context, I think, of the history, our budget document traditionally does show a small deficit on paper, but then in reality, when the true numbers are known, it's balanced or even a bit of a surplus that then goes to capital.
Would you anticipate by December or January we'll have the more accurate numbers?
Absolutely. So we'll have those numbers in our financial reporting, which is typically done in the fall.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I think you just answered my question, Stephanie. So we're anticipating for FY21, we will have a surplus between what our approved budget and what actual expenditures. Is that correct?
In looking back over the last 6 years, that's how far back I had gone, all of our funds had shown a surplus. So even though every year we show a deficit on paper because of the way we budget conservatively for revenues and expenditures, the lapse in expenditures, we end up showing a surplus. That's for operations prior to capital projects. So the fact that we anticipate revenues coming in similar to prior years, I would anticipate that we would have a surplus again this year.
I would say it's on par, and in fact, there were some years where the projected deficit was much greater than that. I don't have FY21 here, but FY20, the deficit was $562,000 in the general fund. Correct. Yeah, of $2.1 million.
Just a reminder
prior
to,
capital.
just a reminder to turn your microphones on when you're speaking, so we can.
So this page, there are actually a couple now. The page I was referencing is comparing FY '22 to FY '21, the current year we're in. The following page steps forward a year, compares FY '23 to FY '22. So again, if you want to look at our budget document and with what we're conservatively projecting both for expenditures and revenues, you can see the 1 year change, but stepping forward between the first and the second year of the budget. And then the third page is just showing prior year information for context. So that next page is showing us just FY '21 information, which is the year we're in right now. I'd like to transition a little bit forward now and talk about personnel and some salary changes that are in this budget. And I will ask that we maybe move ahead to the salary schedule. And that is on page XVII, pardon my ignorance of small Roman numerals. Maybe next year we can do A, or 2 years from now, A through Z out. Or I could learn it between now and then, thank you. That's also possible. Want to talk a little bit about our salary, our personnel, and what this budget is proposing. We traditionally build in a cost of living adjustment into our salary schedule, and that's based on Alaska Urban CPI, which is calculated based on real goods and services, and it's meant to track cost of living in Alaska. It's representative, it used to be called Anchorage CPI, it's representative of urban areas around the state, and they report it for a calendar year a few months later. So they'll look at, for example, 2019, they calculated the cost of living increase at 1.4%. When we were building the FY '21 budget, we got that information, and a few months later, we were quite concerned about the impact of COVID. So I did not include a cost of living adjustment for employees in FY '21 because we were looking for cuts everywhere we could find them. But traditionally, I would have included that in the budget because it's meant to keep our employees' salary on track with inflation. It's meant to keep them on par.
Just for clarification, so the CPI adjustment that you're referencing on this is in addition to the horizontal movement that employees get every year?
Exactly.
Okay.
So cost of living is intended to keep our ranges on par with inflation. The steps, as people move through longevity, are intended to reward people for advancing in their career and staying and growing in their position. And traditionally, we do both. So we have a step system, and then traditionally, the administration recommends a cost of living adjustment to the entire schedule to keep it on par with inflation. Last year, we didn't do that. I'm proposing to do that this year. I'm proposing to give employees this year the cost of living adjustment they would have gotten last year had we known that revenues were going to be sufficient. The cost of living adjustment calculation for this current year was actually negative.
I saw that, and that was my next question. So my understanding with this is the horizontal movement is contractually, it's a contractual obligation between the city and the employee, but the cost of living adjustment is discretionary each year for you?
Thank you, Mr. Chilton. That's correct. So I would say it's not a contractual relationship. It's set up in code. The step system is set up in code for our non-represented employees. For employees that are represented in the public safety union, it is contractual. But the step system is set in code. It sets the percentages and the amounts. And then annually, or now biannually, as we come forward with the budget, cost of living adjustments were typically handled on a policy decision at the budget level.
Okay. Thank you.
So this year's cost of living calculated based on 2020 was negative for the first time in Alaska's history. If I was doing this budget without thinking about last year, we would just propose 0, okay? But what I've included is proposal is a 1.4 because that's what employees would have gotten last year, that because we were so cautiously budgeting, I didn't include in that document. So this salary schedule for non-represented employees includes a 1.4 adjustment. The salary schedule, if you flip to the next page, we've got a separate one for represented employees. Those are our police department employees who are represented by the union. Their salary schedule is a little different because it's dictated by their contract, which has some different stipulations. But another difference is that their contract sets a floor and a ceiling for cost of living adjustments. So although our employees in general last year did not receive a COLA, our police employees that are represented by the union did because it's part of their contract. So they did receive the 1.4 last year. Their cost of living adjustment built into the salary schedule this year is 0.5, because although COLA was negative, the contract stipulates that the floor shall not go below 0.5. So that's what's included. 0.5 is included in the represented salary table. Another change that we're proposing to the salary schedule, if you look at the non-represented employees, that's the page XVII, I'm proposing that we make changes to ranges 1 and 2. We've increased them fairly substantially, and I did this because the City of Seward actually recently completed a salary survey, and they share that information with us, as we do with other communities. One thing that stuck out to me, and it was actually brought to me by our HR director, was that our ranges 1 and 2 were pretty low. They were about $10. So we have employees who work in the library. We've got employees that come on board in the summer in the parks that were making just a little over $10. And that was in line with the minimum wage in the state of Alaska. It felt out of sync with the rest of our ranges, as well as some of our peers. Seward was looking at a much higher starting salary for their lowest end of the range. So what we did was we looked at range number 3. It's that $16.19 an hour at step A. What we did is we backed out 9% to get to a new range 2, backed out 9% again to get to a new range 1. And this is my proposal this year, to increase those ranges for those employees who are categorized as, classified as 1 or 2, to get them much closer to the rest of our salary schedule. Their roles and responsibilities aren't so dramatically different, I don't think, that would justify such a gap in pay. And the fiscal impact of this change is highlighted. It's in the transmittal letter.
Page Roman numeral 4, 20,665.
20,665 is the impact of that change. I feel like it'll make our vacancies advertisements more competitive, particularly with our closest neighbor in Kenai. And I think it provides a starting wage that's more in line with our values and how we compensate other employees of the city. A couple other personnel things. Any other questions about the salary tables before I move on to talk about personnel generally?
Just one quick one. Currently, what are our full-time equivalent employees?
So the number of FTE total is shown on page XV. Sure, yep. XV and XVI. And here you can see each department and the number of FTE and the salary range of those employees.
So currently, we're at 74.31 employees, is that correct? Is that,
Correct.
and then next year, or the new budget would be what, 0.4 increase, roughly?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
And that increase of 0.4, we'll talk through some of those specifics. It actually returns us to where we were approximately in FY20. So again, we cut some positions, some hours. We had, for example, a vacant position at the time in the library. It was cut out of last year's budget. We're putting some of those hours back in this year's budget. So it's an increase of approximately 0.4 of 1 FTE, and it puts us almost exactly on par with where we were 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So a couple other salary employee things I want to point out, and this authorized staffing table is a good point of reference for us to talk through this. One of the things I want to point out is a proposed change in the finance department. We have, okay, so we've got an account clerk and HR payroll assistant that is currently classified at a salary range 13. In reviewing the duties and responsibilities for that position, we feel that it's more accurately reflected as a 14. So we're proposing to reclassify that existing employee from a range 13 to a range 14. A similar change is a proposed reclassification of our assistant parks and rec director. Sometimes I discover these things by looking into something else, and in looking at the equity of our system and where people align, it highlights other certain things. That was the case with this position. We were looking into a different position and where it might fall on our range. And in doing so, it's my opinion that the Assistant Parks and Rec Director is currently classified too low at a 15. So I'm proposing to reclassify that as a 17. A 17, I feel, is, again, more accurately reflective of the roles and responsibilities of that position. Sure.
Go ahead.
So in reclassifying these two positions, will they start over at the beginning of the range, or will they just drop to what, if they're range C, will they stay there in that, when in 14C, or will they have to go to 14A?
They don't have to go to A, and they may drop vertically down. They may be taking 1 or 2 steps back, but it would never result in less pay. So it would still typically result in a promotion in terms of increased pay, especially if we believe that their position was classified incorrectly. So if we're trying to correct it, then they would move the range, and they would either stay where they are, or they may move 1 step back or 2, but it would result in an increase for that person. The next thing I mentioned a little bit earlier was the library. Last year in FY21's budget, we had a vacant position. We were looking for personnel savings, and we didn't fill it at the time. We addressed that by adding some additional on-call hours, and in FY22 in this budget, we're proposing to put that back the way it was. Rachel was very resourceful and did a great job with what she had, but long-term moving forward, really the way that we were staffed before is going to best meet the needs of the library. So if you look at the library department, it'll show a slight increase, and that's related to reinstating that position and correspondingly reducing those extra hours somewhat that we had added last year. It shows a net increase of, it's 0.27 of an FTE, getting us to 7.81 in that department. And again, for reference, we were at 7.77 2 years ago, so it's pretty much on par. One additional change I want to point out that's proposed is the creation, it's also a reclassification of an existing utility operator into what we're going to call a lead operator. I think this is an important position for the city to have because we recognize that we've got somewhat of a gap between the operators who are with us and the department head without much room in between for professional development and growth, for someone to take on leadership responsibilities, for us to have better kind of succession planning within our own department. And so what we're proposing to do, it doesn't change the number of FTE. We would just propose that one of our existing operator positions would be reclassed to a lead operator at a range 17. We would advertise internally for that so that one of our existing employees, if they were interested, could put in for that. And then that lead operator would have greater responsibility in coordinating day-to-day projects, maintenance. In addition to building a better pipeline, I think, for professional growth for our existing employees, it would free up some time from the utility manager from the very busy day-to-day work of that department to be able to focus on more strategic long-term things. So this is, as I mentioned, a proposed reclass of one of our existing positions from a 15 to a 17 with the intent of kind of giving one of our operators some greater responsibility and growth.
Question?
Mr. Carey?
When you sent out the budget and to get input, did you provide any direction such as there are to be no FTE equivalent changes, any additional employees? Were they given that? Or when you sent out is, what do you feel you need? So I'm just wanting a balance there, and what I'm going to follow up with, were there any departments that felt they needed more staff than what you determined was appropriate?
Thank you. I did not give a directive, and I didn't have a target in mind in terms of building this budget and what we want, where we wanted to end in terms of staffing. So we solicited requests from the department heads. They give Melanie 2 things at the beginning of this process: their draft operating budget and any personnel requests. And I don't think that there were any that we received this year that I didn't support and were included in this budget.
Excellent. I think that reflects very well on leadership.
Thank you. The last thing I want to point out, and I alluded to this, typically we bring forward year by year staffing needs based on who we have in positions, which positions are vacant. We make these changes kind of case-by-case basis. That can have the result over time of causing us to want to go back and look at our whole structure and make sure that there's equity in terms of what the different positions are compensated at based on their responsibility, education level, risk to the organization. And so one of the things we've included when we get to the finance budget is some funding for an updated salary survey for the city. So my proposal would be to conduct that work, to do that work in FY22. We've got lots of information from the other salary surveys that are done by our peer municipalities, so it'll be less focused on looking at what our competitors are paying or our neighboring municipalities. It'll be more focused at that question of internal equity, having someone come in and look at our job descriptions, interviewing employees potentially, and just making sure that where we have positions put relative to each other, that they're consistent, that they're based on some framework that makes sense. Because not through goodwill, just occasionally over years of changes, it's helpful to step back and take a look at that every once in a while. So our proposal would be to look at that, do that work over the next year. But even without having done that work, these personnel changes I described, I was comfortable saying that they're important for us to consider right now.
When was the last time we did a salary survey?
Well, the city did one, but it was just for the police department when we were entering negotiations 2.5 years ago, just focused on that department. Broadly, the city of Soldotna has not initiated one recently, but AML does one every year. It's voluntary, and it's fairly high level, so it doesn't dig into, I think, as much detail as we'd need. We have received, as I mentioned, Seward did a very comprehensive survey, and they shared that with us within the last couple of months. So we've got fairly new data about position by position what employers, municipal employers are paying. But in terms of the city conducting one ourselves, generally it's been many years. When was the year where we redid the ranges and moved some positions? That was probably based on a salary survey, and that was maybe
2012.
2012.
Yeah, I'm thinking that's
I
about
didn't hear that.
So 2012.
roughly.
Thanks,
So
Scotty.
it's due.
Melanie, can you think of anything personnel related that I didn't cover?
No, did you want to talk at all about coming back the second year of the biennium and the types of things we're going to bring forward at that time?
Yes, thank you. So I think one of the greatest uncertainties in doing a 2-year budget would be staffing from year to year, because as I mentioned, it depends on who's here, what positions are vacant, who we can move tasks around, but also things like cost of living. So the cost of living that we built into the salary schedule is consistent from 22 and 23. There's no increase in year 2. However, I would anticipate coming back to the council this time next year with a mid-biennium ordinance that requests some additional changes to the budget. One of those would be cost of living. It will be reflective of the new PSEA agreement that we negotiate with the police union. That would be something that would have to be addressed in between years. And I think, so we're not locked into this. We are comfortable presenting this 2 years at a time, but we recognize also that in that in-between year, we have an opportunity to come back to the council with a fairly thorough review, and we would plan to do that.
Supplemental budget request.
We also have
Pretty common.
supplemental budget requests that can come throughout the year at any time.
And we did also talk about in future budgets, when we go back and compare the previous budgets, since there will be adjustments to that second year budget, including those adjustments, that second year of adjustments in treating it as if it was the original budget for comparative purposes, not including all the additional supplemental appropriations that occurred throughout the year, but including that one supplemental biennium, mid-biennium budget request, whatever you want to call it, so that we have comparative budgets to look at.
So I'd like to transition now to the general fund. And as I mentioned, that's going to be the remainder of our discussion is focused on today on the general fund. It starts on page 1 of the document. And this page provides you, again, the prior summary page was all funds combined. Now this is a summary page that is just looking at the general fund, which is our day-to-day operating fund for most of our departments. A couple things we want to point out. This is a good opportunity for me to talk about what I mentioned again about the different columns and adding some extra context. So this budget now includes 2 years of actual. So the first column, FY19 actual and FY20 actual, those are true, certified, known numbers in terms of revenues and expenditures. The next column is not actual. That's FY21's budget. That's the budget numbers that we presented to you last May that were adopted in the budget book. And that's really important because if you look, for example, at sales tax from FY20 actual to FY21 budget, you'll see the significant reduction based on our concerns that didn't end up being realized. But I point that out because, again, FY22 is shaded in gray. That's our proposed 22 budget. FY23 is also shaded in gray. That's our proposed second-year budget. When you're looking at the percentages or the dollar change from year to year, they're going to reflect back to the prior year's budget. And so that's where we see these large increases because of last year's unusual budget. But we've got 2 years of actual numbers, FY19 and 20, to provide that extra context in terms of how our request this year aligns with previous years. Sales tax, as I mentioned, the current year we're in, we think we're going to be essentially flat from a prior year. And so what Melanie and I budgeted for 22 is a 1% increase in brick and mortar sales tax. And we did a 1% increase from 22 to 23 as well. It's not based on very forward-looking analysis of what's out there, what's coming. It's more based on historical averages that we continue to see growth, but at a very modest rate in terms of our brick and mortar businesses and the sales tax revenue they generate. What is new for FY22 for the first time is that we're including within the sales tax estimate the revenue we get from remote sales, online sales. The city, along with the borough, entered into that program and began collecting and receiving returns in March of 2020. So we now have about a full year of that tax revenue. And we included in this budget estimate $250,000 to be collected from internet sales. Because we only have 1 year of budget so far, Melanie and I weren't comfortable projecting a growth rate for that, so we just kept it flat. Both 22 and 23 sales tax includes, for the first time, this $250,000 component from internet sales. Since building this document in reality, I sit on that board that administers the remote sales tax collection on behalf of the member municipalities. That's extremely conservative.
Yeah.
Other finance directors around the state expect that number is going to grow potentially even 20% this year. And that's not just because of consumer trends, it's because they are still working on getting more retailers brought into the program, meaning the companies that sell things, not all of them had the capability to put their software together to sign in right away, and some very large companies are still being brought into that system. And so even if our residents' buying patterns don't change, the fact is that more employers will be then contributing based on compliance.
That was actually my next question is, just in your time with that board, have you seen the rate at which you are onboarding online vendors begin to slow it at all, or is it still pretty much a constant right now?
Actually, I think the onboarding recently has maybe even accelerated
Okay.
because they brought on some additional staff and they got fairly more direct in working with the targeted companies.
So does that working group actually proactively reach out to work with large vendors that they know are generating a lot of revenue and say, hey, you guys need to get on board, register with us, and help them work through that process then?
Absolutely. And it is the case that it is the law that sellers comply, but it's also the case that in order for them to do so, there's a lot of back-end work that has to happen to their systems.
Sure.
And so I think early on the commission staff was fairly flexible in working with vendors and getting people on, and they had a lot of success in early adopters. And then more recently, it was more targeted. But for example, recently Apple just came online. So the revenue that we've gotten to date is not inclusive of still some fairly large companies, but it will be moving forward.
Got it. Has there been any instances that you've heard of companies being resistant to being onboarded with that? And if so, is there any enforcement mechanism that the group has available to them to really kind of, pull someone's arm and get them on board?
Sure. I have not heard significant concerns about much resistance, and that may be also because the threshold to be a seller that has to collect this tax, you're already having to do a fairly high volume of sales.
Got it.
The threshold, I think, is $250,000 of sales a year. So smaller mom and pop businesses are not required to be remitting this tax and signing up. So the businesses that are big national companies, they're doing it in other states. Every other state already has a state sales tax. So they're doing this in other places. It's just been more about outreach, follow-up, to get them on board with our system.
Comment?
Go ahead, Mr. Curran.
Listening to you in terms of that's a conservative amount, it would appear that this new source, at least for us, is going to more than cover the total amount of property taxes that we're looking at. And I just want to let you know, I want to have some discussion with the council on whether or not we need to have property tax. It would seem to me this is a source of revenue that we weren't anticipating that would more than cover it. And so the numbers are relatively close in terms of what we're making versus what property taxes are being discussed. So I just wanted to inform you.
Vice Mayor Parker?
A comment and then a question. In speaking with AML the other day, Nels indicated that there's like 1,000 vendors now that are putting money and remitting sales tax back to communities. And there's still a lot of large vendors that like AT&T hasn't joined in yet. So there's still other vendors that they're working on getting into the system. So that's a lot of vendors that in a year, just over a year, that this commission and the staff have done an exceptional job. And I'm amazed that it came together in a year, and then in the last year, the amount of revenue and vendors that they've been able to reach out to. My question comes to the projection for FY21, and you're projecting our revenue and sales tax will be $7,910,000, and that's where you're making your 1% increase based on that. How did you kind of calculate that number? Based on previous records?
Yeah, that's keeping it pretty in line with what it was in prior years, and looking at the first 2 quarters that we have information on and kind of projecting out what we anticipate getting for the final 2 quarters. It is the 7.91 million. We did then increase it by 1% each year, and that's just the brick and mortar. And then we, like Stephanie mentioned, added in the $250,000 for online sales tax on top of that.
Follow up on online. Is it by zip code? Because I'm going to assume that they don't look to see specifically where someone lives.
Actually, they do. So
They really do?
part of what we paid for, because early on we identified zip code would be problematic because, for example, people outside the city would be taxed at the city
Right.
rate. And so one of the fees that goes to this is actually a mapping company that does mapping of point of delivery where it's delivered. So they know the difference between a 99669 PO box that's on K Beach or one that's inside the city at our post office, and the taxes are calculated correctly based on where that point is in space,
Thank you.
geographically.
Expanding on that, can you clarify how the fee structure with the working group is structured? Do they collect a percentage? Is it a flat rate for their service?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. And I will have to follow up with the specific details, but I can give you the general, because I don't have that information in front of me. But the fee structure essentially is 3 components. One is MuniRevs, which is the big software provider that it has all of the registration. They do the collecting, they do the reporting and the remitting back to municipalities. And we pay a percent to MuniRevs of the revenue that's collected. And it's fairly high. I believe that the fee is 12%. It's structured so that it de-escalates as the statewide amount of revenue that's collected grows. So when we as a state cross 10 million in total revenue of all the members combined, that MuniRevs fee drops. I think it drops to 10%. And then if we get above some bigger threshold, it can drop again. We are very close to that threshold. And our board president, who's the finance director for the city borough of Juneau, is confident that we'll pass it shortly. So that component of the fee will come down. We've also discussed with Muni Revs, now that it's up and running and it's working, renegotiating that in the future. We couldn't have renegotiated it in year one, but the board members are very cognizant of the fees that are being paid, and there will be an opportunity to revisit that at the next agreement renewal. So the one is the Muni Revs, the second is TTR. That company does the mapping. They do the geographic mapping, and then they've got databases that say if you're on this side of the line, this is the tax structure. If you're on this other side, it's this other tax structure. They help sellers apply the right numbers. So there's a small fee component of that, as well as the commission itself, which is staffed by AML. And they have legal fees, they've got personnel, they've got materials and supplies. So a small component of that goes to the commission expenses itself. All in, I think the fee structure it's about 17% or even a little bit more in terms of 17.25 of the revenue is then paid to those three entities. And that's a number that we hope to get lower in the future. It's a fairly high number. It's also true that individual communities could not do this alone. It had to be done collectively as a commission. And so if a community thought, we could do this ourselves, legally we couldn't, because to comply with the Supreme Court decision, it has to be streamlined, it has to be unified. And so this is a fee that we hope to see drop in the future and that we believe will.
Last question, if I may. Sorry, you made me think of another one in your explanation of that. I remember at some point in the past it was mentioned the borough was exploring a similar model of capturing a percentage of revenue as a service for administering our local sales tax. Has there been any updates on that, and should we expect maybe a modification of the revenue stream that we're getting through the borough because of that maybe occurring halfway through this biennial budget?
I haven't been involved in any of those discussions, and I think that the city would push back fairly strongly on that. As a second-class borough, one of their powers and responsibility is sales tax collection. And so there haven't been any discussions recently that I've been a part of that suggested that they were thinking about that.
Okay, good, thank
Not
you.
that I'm aware of.
Just one more clarification. In terms of the mapping that's being done, if a person outside the city was using a post office box in the city, would they know if the person actually lives outside in terms of getting online sales tax?
In that scenario, they would be taxed at the city rate, because the way the law is written, the ordinance, is that it's wherever that good or service is delivered and picked up by the customer, that's the applicable tax rate. So if that person were to deliver it to their home and FedEx or UPS took it to their home, it would be at the borough rate. But if it's delivered and picked up by the consumer in Soldotna at the post office, it is taxable revenue to the city of Soldotna. And that's how, as I mentioned, that's how the code was written.
So we do get at least a little bit from people who live outside the city.
We've got quite a few PO boxes in Soldotna, so I would expect it's somewhat substantial in terms of deliveries into our post office.
Ms. Hutchings, you had a question?
Yes, the thing is that talking about the borough and doing their own collection or their own program, I sat and listened to a lot of borough meetings, and there was no way that they were going to put the money into it that would need to be done. This was a much easier fix using AML. And so I don't think you'll ever see that happen, because the administration of that particular program would be overwhelming for the small area that they would be working with, whereas with AML, you're covering everywhere. And a comment on people getting mail in Soldotna, we are providing the sidewalks and the streets for all of those people that come in and pick up their mail, so it's only right.
Just a comment. Actually, somebody told me they do all their shopping online. And I said, well, you realize you're paying sales tax on that? And they said, what? I said, you've been paying sales tax on it for over a year. Look at your bill. And they never realized it. So there's probably a lot of people that just still don't realize that there is a sales tax on internet sales.
Looking now again, still at page 1, the next thing that Melanie and I wanted to point out and just speak a little bit, because it's timely in terms of council conversations is interest earnings from our investments. This page will show you where we budget for that interest as revenue. And so if you look under other revenues, interest is the third line item down. Here you'll see also looking at actuals that our investment earnings returned $812,000 to the general fund in FY19, $596,000 the following year. In the current year, FY22, we're budgeting $438,405 in investment earnings. That's based on a conversation with Bill at Alaska Permanent Capital. He looks at the 10-year projection for our fund. He tells us what he thinks that's going to mean in the most immediate coming year. And based on that and the amount of funds, we project that interest earnings. And as you can see, the interest earnings, as well as the online sales tax, as well as the other revenue sources, they all combine into this budget that down at the bottom of the page tells you, at least per the document, expenditures exceed revenues by $445,000 in the general fund. And that's not a concerning number to us, as we mentioned, because of some of the conservative assumptions we use in putting it together. But it highlights, I think, the importance of the city's ability to draw revenue from those investment earnings. Here's on the budget where they end up in our budgeting. And if there were no earnings from our investments, if that $438,000 were to go away, on paper our deficit would be much, much larger. We rely on those funds. Any other? Go ahead, Melanie, please.
Just going to say one additional thing to point out is that $438,000 is just the general fund portion of the interest. Each of the other funds also have their portion of the interest.
Under the liquor license, I notice it's going down. Is that because it's liquor license renew every other year?
That is just looking at the last 5 years, like the 5-year average. And so some years they go up and some years they go down, and we kind of project it over a 5-year average. And so that's kind of where they have come in at.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure the reason why they fluctuate so much.
Well, they renew every other year. So it depends on what.
Yeah, and there's some years where they're very consistent too. So I don't know if some renew in 1 year and others renew in the next year, and they kind of even out generally. I'm not sure.
The next pages 2 and 3 are giving you a bit more detail on the general fund revenues. There you can really see how detailed we break out, for example, Parks and Rec revenues. Melanie spends quite a bit of time with Andrew finding out what the teams are doing and what events are happening. And
I have one question I wanted to ask on, well, maybe two, on sales tax. Airbnbs, are we finally getting that squared away? Because we used our cabin at Sport Lake as an Airbnb 1 year, and Airbnb charged sales tax, they said, but they never reported it. We had to back it out of what we received from them after all of their fees and send it into the borough. So what I don't know is if we have managed to close that loophole.
that's a question I'll follow up and get some more information from the borough.
Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned, AT&T still isn't on board, and they have just started a merger with Discovery and somebody else, so that's going to be, and they're part of DirecTV. That's huge money.
Yeah, thank you for that. We'll follow up with the borough on compliance with the short-term rentals. I know I was part of a conversation more than a year ago about getting some software to help identify short-term rental business owners who weren't yet compliant with the borough's sales tax code. And I can get an update on how that's going and where they're at.
Speaking of Parks and Rec, how was the attendance at the games this past weekend?
It was there. It was close to the 750.
Like I said, revenue summary continues on page 2 with a bit more detail of different line items. Page 3 is showing expenditures, a summary of each department with all those years for reference. Any other, last page, that's kind of the general fund overview pages on page 4. That is expenditures by account type. So you can look at the different accounts that exist in each of our departments and, for example, see, how are we doing on health insurance as a whole across the board. So these are telling you for that account type across the entire general fund, what's the impact. Health insurance, we're very happy to report, up 1.5%. For example, this is the page that tells you across the board where that is. That's not reflective of our rates. That's reflective of positions changing and people's elections changing and the type of coverage they want. But this is a page that can tell you for materials and supplies or for professional services across the board, kind of where are we at as a city. And then
Across the board for the general fund.
yes, across the board for the general fund. Thanks, Melanie. Any questions about these? Next, we're going to really dive into the different departments and start talking through them. All right, well, mayor and council is first, and because you're the most important. And Shelley, we'll ask Shelley to maybe elaborate on this. But first, I'll just ask, Shelley, do you want to present, or would you like Melanie to go through and highlight some of the changes? Perfect.
Thank you. So first, you'll see a slight increase in your travel budget. The changes in the travel budget every year depends on where that AML summer conference is. It's more expensive to get to Sitka than it is Fairbanks, so that's why it increases. And then in 2023, it's going to be in Homer, and I increased that substantially because I figured it's within driving distance. More of you will be attending that. Generally, we do only budget for 2 council members to go to the summer conference and the winter conference. And the Anchorage is based on the average of how many actually go. So that number changes every year.
Before you get too far along, the summer conference this year will be under the 22 budget, correct?
Yes, and it will be in Sitka.
Well, it's in Fairbanks. August is going to be in Fairbanks.
Correct, and that's, how is that?
Yeah.
Backwards. We had put Fairbanks in last year's budget. Let me look at that, but yeah. Because yeah, last year we had put Fairbanks, so, and then with dues and subscriptions, the increase there is at the request of Mayor Whitney to include a membership with the National League of Cities. That is the membership rate. And advertising and promotion, we had some substantial increases this year. The Progress Days event is no change, even though we're changing the venue. We're still going to be sharing expenses for the sound equipment and other operating supplies with the chamber. And at this point, we're not sure of how all of the costs for the new booth is going to line up. So I anticipate that that number could drop. However, at this point, we don't have all the numbers in yet. And then the big change is our audio streaming. So last August, we added video, which increased the amount of data we were generating, and we had to do a budget amendment to increase how much we were paying because we were using more storage than we were paying for. This new budget amount would allow for unlimited storage and also put closed captioning available. And it also has a small minor meeting management component to it that we haven't got to work with yet, but Deputy Hewitt and I actually sat through a demonstration on it. So this would allow unlimited data if we continue with the video and the closed captioning feature, and that is the primary changes. I do know that Councilmember Chilson had talked about during the mini grant committee about proposing and also a change to that. So, but I did not include that in this, so.
So, I could clarify, AML's meeting last year was supposed to be in Fairbanks, but because of COVID, it was virtual, and so that's why they kept it for this next fiscal year, kept it Fairbanks and just bumped everybody a year.
Thank you, Councilmember Parker. And I'm sure when I looked at these things in January, they had not updated the website to reflect that. That's where I got my information. Any questions?
Professional services in FY19 was 165. Is that primarily the chamber, which is now in the non-departmental?
Professional services includes, there's small pieces of that probably throughout many department budgets. It also includes our legal fee, our attorney fees, our professional services.
I believe back then was legal fees and also our auditing fees. Legal fees are now in non-departmental and the auditing fees are in the finance department.
I see what you're saying. It shows up in FY19 actual and then drops off. Yes, so the visitor center contract, legal fees, auditing fees in that year were all moved to non-departmental. Yep. So that the mayor and council budget could be more reflective of the mayor and council needs and not have some of these other citywide things put in your budget. All right, thanks, Shelley. Moving forward, next department is the city manager budget. This is just myself and Laura, 2 FTE. And there are not significant changes. Really, this is restoring a lot of the categories to pre-COVID budgeting. So my department budget actually has a fairly high travel and training per employee budget. 3 of the 5 items are AML related. So traveling to Juneau during the, which I have not done yet because of COVID, but traveling to Juneau for the legislative session, the summer and winter meetings, as well as 1 professional development opportunity each for myself and for the assistant. The other thing that we restored was contracted services. In my budget, that's typically used for projects to try and have, bring in some expertise or consulting to look at a process, or we might be evaluating how we do our wellness program. We might be evaluating our 457 plans. That's typically what I use contracted services for. Because we didn't have extra time to do any of that last year, we lowered that budget amount, but we're proposing to put it back to where it was in the prior years. So they show up as increases in this year. And the only other note I'll make is that professional development and travel in general was something that I'm very supportive of. I strongly advocated in past years for our department heads to find ways to increase that and give more educational opportunities to our employees. But that was also one of the things that was cut last year. There wasn't a lot of travel happening anyway. Certainly many events were canceled anyways. But consistent throughout the budget as we look forward, what you're going to see this year is increases in travel and training fairly across the board as we reinstate that, which had been a priority of mine previously. Any other questions about the city manager budget? All right, I'm going to now throw it over to Melanie to talk about the finance department. Sure, I can do the overview. Looking at page 11 of the budget book, this is now really the first instance where you'll see that staff allocation table in a meaningful way, giving you more information about how we divide up people's salary among different departments. So you can see down here the account clerk 3, APAR. That is an employee who does all the utility billing. So she's here at City Hall, she's in the finance department. A substantial amount of her work and duties is in supporting the utility department by processing their billing, dealing with customers who have billing inquiries. So because the utility fund is a separate fund that should be paid for with those user fees, not with general fund tax revenue, we allocate, you can see 25% of her time to the water department, 25% of her time to the sewer department, because she is doing that work on behalf of the utility department. And
So just to clarify, is this a half-time employee, or is this half of their time, their full-time employee with 0.5 FTE to the finance department, 0.25 to water, and 0.25 to sewer?
good question. It is one full-time person, and half of her salary shows up in this department budget, 25% of it in water, 25% of it in sewer. If you refer back to the authorized staffing table at the beginning, right before you get to the salary, that's going to tell you where people are located in our facilities and how many FTE, how many positions we have. So in that page, it'll show that the finance department has 1 FTE of this account clerk 3. Now, as we move through department budgets, it's going to show you how do we allocate that person's time if it's a person that their time gets split, which not everybody does.
So in the water and sewer departments, you'll also see her name.
Sure.
I mean,
Just the
her
way this was
position.
laid out, I wasn't sure if they're 0.5 FTE with a quarter of that, so essentially 12.5% of it going to water and 12.5% going to sewer.
Right.
Question? I really support the cost causer being the cost payer. Do you have a threshold, like does it have to be at least 1/10 of the total amount? Or these are both a quarter, which is a pretty easy number. But do you have a threshold, or will you go down to, again, 3% of what they do is, and then do a 0.03?
That's a good question, and Melanie and I spent a lot of time, she was educating me on how we do this. We don't have a specific threshold, but I will say it's most important when general fund resources are being used by non-general fund funds. So for the airport, if we can say that we've got, 10% of the streets crew doing snow maintenance at the airport, we're gonna bill that 10%. With finance, in this case, it's half of her time. So we don't have a specific threshold. I will just mention this, but we weren't gonna talk a lot about it. Another way that municipalities deal with this is by charging administrative fees to the different funds. We, the city, have not done that. I was in Homer yesterday meeting with 3 other city managers. It's fairly common, and many municipalities do both. For people who dedicate a portion of their time, that salary piece is dedicated, and they charge an administrative fee. And that's meant to capture the fact that my time, the council's time, our attorney's time, the clerk's time, many general fund services support these different funds, and an administrative fee is one way that you try to bring that equity to the payers. Now that I've said that, it may be something that we talk about in the future. But it was not something that we were prepared to tackle right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Parker?
Thank you, Mayor Whitney. So the account clerk 3, range 13, this is the one you're proposing to change to a 14?
It's actually the position right above that. The account clerk 4 is the one that would be reclassified from a 13 to a 14.
But on page Roman numeral 3, it says account clerk 3, payroll, okay, payroll HR, gotcha, thank you.
Thank you for double checking that. And Melanie found a few typos. And we are happy to hear feedback on anything we missed as we go through the document.
Yeah, there was a lot of changes to this document, and so if we only found, I found 2 so far. If that's all there is, I'm really happy with that. So
I'd like to find
please
more.
let me know if you find some. I'm happy to correct them.
Okay, that's kind of the general finance. Melanie, will you talk about some of the changes in the finance department?
Sure.
that are proposed.
So, like Stephanie mentioned before, you'll see throughout this document a lot of restoring travel and training and maybe some other accounts to pre-COVID levels that happened in the finance department. We restored some professional development for my position and also added a couple of other ongoing new training opportunities for a couple of staff. The other thing to highlight in this department is just the completion of the salary survey, which Stephanie previously mentioned. And I think that's probably the big takeaways from finance. We also restored some dues and subscriptions to pre-COVID levels.
Mr. Carey?
Yes. I was wondering in terms of contracted services, what are the things you contract out? I noticed for 22, 26,000 total. So what are the contracted services?
So if you look on page 13, we do background checks on new
Excellent.
hires. We have an HR consultant line item there for any things that pop up that we may need to have professional consulting on. The salary survey is also included in there, and then also our PAFR distribution is included in there. The PAFR, our popular annual financial report that we're so proud of every year.
Oh, I like that.
That we send out to all residents, and so that generally includes the printing of it and mailing of it. We did add a little bit in this year for design if needed.
So what I was wondering, and again, I thank you for what you're saying, it helps. it's significantly higher than it was, again, a year plus, actually 2 years as well. Is there something we're contracting now that we didn't do before, or is there something that we just have a whole lot more of now than what we had done before?
Salary
So,
survey.
yeah, so there's an increase of $11,250 in the FY '22 budget. 10,000 of that is from the salary survey.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Moving on, next department is IT, and, oh, Bryce is on Zoom with us. Great. Hi, Bryce. Sure. All right, welcome Bryce Cunningham's our IT manager. These are the folks at the city that keep really everything running. Bryce and Jeremy, our IT technician, we increased this department to 2 full-time equivalent some years prior, recently. That was absolutely necessary to be able to keep up with the growing demands of supporting all of our various departments and the technological solutions and the hardware and the software. So the IT department budget is here. Melanie is going to cover a few of the significant changes.
So again, restoring some items to pre-COVID levels. You'll notice in FY '23, as Stephanie mentioned, we increased we added an additional staff. And so travel and training, we added some money in the FY '23 budget for additional training for that position. Also included here, professional services. It's included under contracted services. That's a new line item, but we anticipate keeping it in there going forward. Small tools and minor equipment has some changes to it, and that's basically a replacement of various things that are based on replacement schedules that Bryce has established. So some of those years will be an increase and some will be a decrease, but should kind of tie back to those replacement schedules. We also eliminated something that was like a one-time purchase that was in a prior fiscal year, so that did bring the increase down some. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. Oh, wait, computer software was another one, where in the prior year we had budgeted for a specific one-time item, and it was upgrading some software, and that was eliminated in the FY '22 budget because that was completed in FY '21. So that's why you'll see the decrease there.
So this is a good example of a department where it's more common to see fluctuations in some of these categories based on actual projects. Some of the more administrative type departments, their contracted services budget or materials and supplies are fairly consistent from year to year. That's not the case in some of our departments like IT or roads, where they are doing projects, or utilities even, where it really just depends on the work they're doing that year. So as Melanie mentioned, that's why there's maybe an increase in small tools, minor equipment, but a decrease in software. It's based on the replacement of the hardware and scheduling of projects.
Seems to be quite a fluctuation in the health insurance over the years, going from 31 to 25 to 59 and then back down to 40 again.
So this would be a good example of taking a increase from a part-time to a regular full-time position. That would impact the health insurance contributions by the employer, by us. And then it's also based on, I think, elections, where people make choices during open enrollment every year, whether they want an employee-only plan, whether employee plus dependents, or a family plan. And so people have the opportunity to change that election from year to year. The city pays 90% of the premium portion for the employee-only plan. We pay 80% for all those other plans. And so based on people's choices, or if we have a vacant position, we will probably budget conservatively, not knowing who's going to come into that position, what their needs will be. We'll budget for that full family plan. But that's part of the fluctuation when you start looking at department by department, is just individual choices.
You know, an $18,000 reduction, though, seems to be pretty substantial.
Yeah, that could have just been because of a change in employee election, like she had talked about, or a vacancy where maybe we budgeted for employee family coverage and the employee came in and chose chose employee-only coverage or something like that. There's a substantial difference between those two types of plans.
Just as anecdotally, I'll tell you, I dropped my husband off our health insurance plan the other year. He's still a bit sore about it, but I came home and I said, this is going to save us $2,000, and it's going to save the city $12,000. So just even one decision like that is significant, as Melanie said. So
Yeah, if you look at overall, we had, I think it was a 1% increase in health insurance rate, the health insurance budget across all funds. It's about $12,000 for the year because of the low rates that came in and because of these additional changes in employee elections.
And I asked Melanie also to look back at the last 5 years of what our rate increases have been. And the average premium increase over the last 5 years annually is
About 4.5%. We had 2 years, and this year included, where we had no increase at all. Other years, around 7.5% increase.
So if I'm remembering right from the transmittal letter, it was a 1% increase this year in premium cost?
It's a 1% increase in total insurance budget costs.
Okay. Which is,
But
So
we
the
had-
rates actually went up nothing. The rates were flat.
which is impressive because the average cost of healthcare in the state went up about 10%, so.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate. About 10 years ago, rates increased substantially. And we actually toyed with the idea of switching out of the plan that we're in. We didn't do it at that time, and since then, we've been very fortunate to have some, increases most of the time. Some years where there's been no increases, but even when there's been increases, they've been fairly minimal.
Sure.
We've also had about 13 months of premium holidays where the city and the employee have not had to pay premiums, and that saved the city over $860,000,
So-
and employees almost $210,000. So it's substantial.
A question about the plan the city is currently with the Alaska Poly sub. Does that, do you have reinsurance on top of that, or is all of the insurance covered directly through Poly sub? Because I know a lot of self-insured agencies will have one provider for the main, they provide the main source of insurance revenue, and then there's like an additional provider that comes in and insures the employees if they have over a certain cap of expenditures each year.
No, everything is through Aetna, through
Okay.
the Polysub plan. We have a high deductible plan, and the city does reimburse a portion of the deductible, and we have it administered through a different company, and that's to keep the rates down. So that's factored into this calculation as well, but our only insurance company is through Aetna.
Okay.
And by being part of that poly-sub plan, we're part of a bigger, coverage pool where that risk is kind of mitigated over many different entities. And so it's less impacted by changes within our employees. It's what's happening in that much bigger pool of which we participate.
Question?
Mr. Karen?
Every employee is critically important, and we can't do without them, but many of them have backups. I think police, again, so important, law enforcement, but there are others that, I'm wondering, is there a succession plan, and my terminology is for IT, if both of them got really sick or incapacitated? Do we have someone that can fill in for a while? And my terminology may be wrong, but again, I think of it as a succession plan. Do we have that covered in case both of them got very, very sick?
Thank you for that question. It's critically important. And
Yes.
one of the things that Bryce and I have talked about, we do a lot of work with an outside firm called GCSIT. They perform some of our assessments. They also assist and support our staff in some of the installations. I think for a municipality our size, we would first look to some of our friends at the borough or the city of Kenai if we were in an emergency type situation, but also would have the ability to reach out to this company for contracted support through if there was ever a point in time where our services were at risk of being interrupted.
Excellent, thank you. And the manager could never be replaced either.
Any other questions in the IT department budget? Bryce, would you like to add anything to what we covered?
Guess not.
No, he's muted again.
There we go. Need some technical support with my microphone.
We can hear you now, Bryce.
No, I think you guys did a good job of going over it, and thank you. Yeah, mainly big increase to the training back from pre-COVID times, getting back into the professional development mode. And then professional services, that was a jump up for FY22 and FY23, and that's geared towards a annual review of our software-defined environment. It's like our hypervisor and network side of things. Those are the biggest changes.
Any questions for Bryce? I'm not seeing any. Thank you so much, Bryce. Moving on to the next budget, I'll throw it back again to Shelley for the city clerk department.
Thank you. So travel and training increase is due to bringing things back up to the pre-COVID level. Our contracted services the increase is related to a 2-year plan to bring planning and zoning early 70 records up to the current archive system. Right now, they are compiled in the minutes, and we'd like to break them out like individual legislations like we do for the city council. Our support and maintenance contract, those were increases to our support and maintenance agreements with eDocs and social media archiving, and the addition of the InDesign software for the clerk's office. Where you're going to see our largest increase this year is with elections. That is due to the borough now charging us for services previously not charged for. The state of Alaska increased the pay for election workers, which applies to our elections as well. The Clarion increased their advertising rate. And this also includes $2,000 to do a postcard mailer to all city voters that will update them on when our election is, how to apply for an absentee ballot. It'll just be a overall, here's what your election this year. If you want to vote absentee, these are your options, and here's how you do it. And then there's also for this year, we have to replace our by mail election supplies. The printers print these in a batch of 1,000, and I had purchased enough for 10 years, and then we used 3 years supply last year. So I think we need to make sure we're covered in case we have an increase in by mail voters again this year. And then the FY23, every 3 years we have an employee election to elect their representation on the employee relations board. So that is what that $750 is for that employee election. Any questions?
Vice Mayor Parker?
The charges coming from the borough, how did the borough determine what the cost was going to be?
So what they are proposing, thank you for the question, is there'll be a memorandum of agreement that will be going before the assembly and will come before the council. The proposed charge for a regular election is $500 for their ballot programming, $100 for their logic and accuracy testing of the ballots, and then a $100 charge per page in the voter pamphlet. And that is the borough's fees.
We have this trend coming from the borough that whatever you do, there's going to be user fees coming to us from the borough.
And those election fees would go up in case we had like a special election or anything like that?
They are proposing, so when we have a special election, the borough clerk programs our ballots, and that is the rest of it I do. So they're proposing a flat fee of, $1,500, I believe, but I haven't looked at that document since February. So that would be, if we scheduled a special election, the equipment, use of the equipment and the ballot programming would be included in that, and then I would perform the logic and accuracy testing and all the other. So this is just for a regular election.
Okay, so that is not being considered at this point in time. Okay.
No, so if the council were to schedule a special election, our appropriation ordinance for conducting that would include those fees.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We're moving on. The next department is the police department. We've got Chief Milnarek with us here today, and I'll invite him to kind of add any additional commentary or thoughts. But as you can see, we've got some staffing information here on the sworn, and and the more administrative personnel within the department. Really substantial change is the ongoing discussions with the borough about the fee we pay for dispatch services. It's yet, not yet fully resolved, and maybe I'll talk a little bit more to that in a minute. But how that shows up in the budget, previously, both the fee we pay to the city of Kenai for animal shelter consolidated services, as well as dispatch, were contained within a single account called contracted services. I asked Melanie to break those out so that those two exist on their own lines and I guess are a bit more easily identified within the budget. So that's one change. It shows up as a significant reduction in the contracted services lines, and that's because we removed animal shelter contract as its own line item, that $42,000, and dispatch services contract is now its own line item, $350,000. Previously, the city had been paying $150,000. The borough approached us in January and informed us that our new fee would be almost $500,000, and we are continuing negotiating back and forth.
So the 350,000 is not a finalized accepted rate on both sides. That's just kind of like a ballpark somewhere in the middle we're hoping to settle at then, is that correct?
350 is a number that we were tentatively working with in drafting an agreement. And so it represents, I think, a potential one-year solution.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to speak more to that. But the attorney, our attorney, Brooks Chandler, is working with the borough attorney on the agreement itself. And 350 represents a compromise one-year adjustment that I'd be happy to speak to now or when that agreement is finalized and brought before the council for your consideration. And I'd maybe invite Chief, if there's anything you want to add or join us maybe for part of that discussion as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's tentative right now until the contract is signed, but it sounds like that was the number that was agreeable to them.
Sure. Is there any legal obligation that they provide services while we're working this out? My concern being is obviously dispatch is paramount to public safety, and if negotiations were to stall out, worst case scenario, I mean, is there the possibility that they could just cut off services? I would expect they wouldn't do that. But.
They can't because they have to take care of the 911 calls. They can't just organize them, which means just take a 911 call and leave it. We don't have any way to receive them. So they have to at least take the 911 calls. They could probably stop doing the other dispatch for us, but they couldn't do the 911 calls.
That would be my assumption as well, just clarifying. Thank you.
Question?
Go ahead.
I was just wondering, and I don't want you to the chief or whomever, kind of demographically in terms of our police, in terms of age, do we anticipate any or some retiring in the next couple of years?
We have, three officers that are eligible to retire. They have 20 years, whether or not they will. One of them, the longest ones, are close to 29. I mean, with the lieutenant on down, who's got a lieutenant of 29 years. So yeah, the possibility. 25 years is generally the magic number, because that's when you can get health insurance.
Yeah.
So people usually strive unless they got something else going to make it 25 or 20. You can go to 20 years.
And if I could just follow up on the other side, how many members of the department have been with us less than 5 years or less?
I think the person we hired, the last person we hired has been over 5 years now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Remarkable. Well done, Chief.
It's impressive. I keep thinking of additional questions as everyone else kind of like spurs my curiosity in their questions. So kind of on that note, as our older employee demographic ages out and retires, is there much of a cost savings realized to the city with those older employees on the PERS 1 through 3 plans and then replacing them with PERS 4 employees? Or is it pretty comparable in cost on our portion of the employee benefits?
So let me answer. And do you want to go for it? And tell me if I'm absolutely wrong. I think there's no impact because even Tier 4 employees, like myself, we are paying an on-behalf contribution for the liability provided for Tier 1, 2, and 3
I
employees.
just wasn't sure if the on-behalf contribution was notably less on the tier 4 versus tiers 1 through 3 with the defined benefit versus
It's exactly the
contribution.
same.
Oh, it is.
So
Okay.
it doesn't feel fair, but for Tier 4 employees, we are contributing on their behalf for the liability of obligations owed by Tiers 1, 2, and 3.
I missed my tier 3 window by 6 months, so I
Yep,
feel you.
you and me both.
And
Take one for the team. We're all a big work family.
and I thank you also, I'm a tier 1.
We're all still very grateful. Any other questions for Police Department?
Are we still looking at the possibility of doing our own dispatching in the future?
Chief, why don't I ask you to speak a little bit about the work you've done, up to this point and kind of.
So we've looked into that, and we've talked to different vendors, just as a ballpark figure to get it kicked off. Okay, so just as a ballpark figure, probably to get it kicked off initially would be about $1 billion, I imagine, and that would be startup fees, and then to maintain it, you're looking at, with personnel costs and management, probably $600,000 to $700,000 a year. That's just kind of ballpark of what we came up with.
Thank you.
One additional comment is our existing 3-year agreement with the represented employees ends at the end of FY22. So we will be renegotiating with the union in the spring of 2022, and the results of that discussion in the new agreement that's put in place will be brought back to the council with some adjustments for the second year of the biennium.
So just to clarify, the only represented employee base we have would be our police employees, and then all the other employees are non-represented, and they basically get the salary that is determined by administration. Is that correct?
It's correct that the only represented employees we have are PSEA police. There's no other unionized represented employees at the city. There had been in the past.
Is there any form of negotiation with the non-police employees, or is it more of just this is what we're looking at doing and that's how it is kind of structure?
So there's guidance in the city code for non-represented employees because our code speaks to positions are approved by the council, and then the pay ranges are set by the council, either through ordinance or resolution or the budget document. So the salary ranges, it's not a direct negotiation with employees, it's set by this budget book or by the council through another action. So when we advertise positions, we've got the range identified, then we have administrative flexibility on where we start people on that range based on experience. So we do that piece administratively, and then people move forward through our steps per the prescribed kind of schedule.
Just to clarify, in case you don't know, the police officers themselves, no sergeants are represented, the lieutenant, anything above, isn't in the union. So the police officers themselves, the line officers, and the police clerk are the union, and the rest aren't.
Got it.
Thank you, that's important, yeah. So the chief, the lieutenant, and the sergeants are not represented by PSEA. So they would fall on under generalized city policies and the non-represented salary schedule. Traditionally, when we bring forward the budget, oftentimes we'll incorporate changes or benefits that were negotiated in the union with the sergeants, because it's important to maintain, kind of not have compression where line employees are catching up or potentially surpassing our sergeants, our non-represented employees. So we deal with that just administratively through the budget process.
And I'm assuming any negotiation that we have with PSEA would have to be ratified when it's done by the council, that we don't find ourselves in a position where you're binding the hands of a future council to be obligated to pay a higher contract with them that they didn't have a say in. Is that correct?
Correct. So those contracts are negotiated, and we meet over the course of a few months, and then a resolution, it's ratified and brought to the council by resolution for approval.
Okay.
Vice Mayor Parker, do you have a question? Okay.
Great. Thank you, Chief. Moving on to the next department is Public Works. Kyle Cornelis is here with us, and Just wanted to point out, his position is one where, you guys know he wears many hats. One of them is airport director, airport manager. We also allocate a portion of the public works director's time to water and sewer, though we're proposing to reduce that in how much we allocate in this year's budget. Previously, Kyle had played a larger role in kind of executive functions of that department. Moving forward, Melanie checks in once a year as we're preparing the budget and thought that that allocation could be reduced. So if you look, we're just proposing a very small portion of his time, 5% to water and sewer, whereas previously I think each of those were 10% each. And in addition to the Public Works Director, this department has our building official. That's a vacancy we're currently advertising for, as Ralph Lynn, our longtime building official, is retiring at the end of the month, as well as our project manager and administrative assistant. And I'll kick it over to Melanie to talk about any budget highlights.
Basically the same as in previous departments and future departments that we'll discuss. Just restoring to pre-COVID levels for a few different items. And also placing a greater emphasis on professional development, as Stephanie kind of highlighted before. That's really the only changes to this department. Pretty consistent with prior years.
Kyle, do you have a microphone? Anything you'd like to add or?
I don't have anything really to add. It's a pretty boring budget. I'm happy to answer any questions.
How long has Ralph been with the city? 20-plus years?
We'll find out. We're
Yeah.
having a barbecue for him on Tuesday in a week. Quite a long time in 2 separate stints. So Ralph was with us as the building official for many years, went away to take other opportunities and then returned and has been with us another significant chunk of time. Well respected and a great resource in our building community, for sure.
Question, and it may have been I just wasn't listening clear enough. When you said that he was retired, and then you mentioned immediately 1 or 2 or 3 other people. He's the only one retiring? Am I correct to assume that?
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, next department is the shop department, and this is one of the divisions that Scott Thunberg oversees in his responsibilities. This department, this division, the council approved the new position, if you recall earlier this year, for the maintenance technician that's joining our mechanics that are out at the Funny River shop. So that position was approved mid-year by appropriation, but it's included, those numbers are reflected in this budget document for the first time. In addition, the shop supports really all of our fleet maintenance. They are busy with heavy equipment, small tools, police cars, administrative vehicles. They keep everything kind of working and up and running. And as I mentioned, they're located at the aging shop that's down at the end of the airport off of Funny River Road.
Travel and training, we had increased because of the new position that Stephanie mentioned. And then we also added a small one-time purchase under small tools. Those are pretty much the highlights. If there's any questions?
Scotty, would you like to share?
Yeah, just keeping the fleet running, just a tremendous amount of, everything comes our way, parks, lawnmowers, like I said, the police fleet, snow blowers, everything coming through the shop out there. This has been a huge thing for us, as far as ordering parts, and he's gonna start doing inventory, tracking stuff with me and doing safety, so that new position out there is working out really well. I've been spending a lot of time working with him, figuring out our program. We're gonna do some more training for him in the public works program, and I think it's gonna be a really nice thing for our department. And we're doing some hands-on things too. He's doing streetlight ballasts for us right now. We actually pulled streetlight ballasts down. We've been bringing them out to him. He's wiring them all up for us. We can go back out there, pick them up, and go up and put them up. So, not only is he doing administrative stuff, but doing some hands-on stuff. Doing well. It's a never-ending process of aging new equipment that we've been able to purchase.
Vice Mayor Parker.
Thank you. And I do appreciate the work that our guys do around town, whether it's summertime or wintertime. I saw them out flushing hydrants today, and people were having fun as they were going through the big puddles. I noticed that overall for salary benefits and operation and maintenance, overall the increases are quite a bit higher than the other departments. 43.5% in salary and benefits and 30% in ops and maintenance. Why is that?
That would be because we added that additional position. It's comparing it to last year's budget, and it was not included in last year's budget. That position was brought forward mid-year through an ordinance.
I remember that, yeah. Okay, thank you.
The next department is the Streets Department. Again, same crew, Scotty, several operators, as well as our administrative assistant, and some short-term supplemental labor that we bring on both in the summer and the winter. Here you'll see how some of those folks' time is split out between the different divisions within the maintenance department, between the shop, buildings, and airport. And starting on page 34 and 35 of the document, we go into some of the department details.
So again, restoring to pre-COVID levels. In materials and supplies, we did eliminate a prior year one-time purchase that was pretty significant, so you'll see the reduction for that there. In contracted services, the snow hauling budget was increased because for the last several years, we've exceeded what was budgeted, and we've relied on contingency to pay for that. And so beginning in FY '22, we did increase the snow hauling budget. In FY '23, in contracted services, we included an amount for installation of gutter bins that will help catch debris in the various storm drains around the city. And I believe that's kind of a pilot program, and if it works out well, Scotty's plan would be to do some more around the city. So that's included in FY '23. And I think that's pretty much the highlights.
Question?
Mr. Karen?
Does Streets, are they the ones that do the Joel Wilkins flag program?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Very much that you do it. It's wonderful.
We'll soon see, we're getting everything cleaned up, so you'll see banners and our flags will come out. We kind of wait till after the dust and debris, kind of on our final washing stages of the highway, and then you'll start seeing the banners and the ornamental flags come out around the city here this year.
Any other questions for the Streets Department? As Melanie mentioned, many years ago, the snow hauling budget was cut pretty dramatically. And the thought at the time is that contingency money could be used to supplement that. We've now seen that that's happening fairly regularly, and that original budget should actually be increased. And so the increase of the snow hauling, it's at 90,000. Previously, it had been at 70,000. So we think that 90,000 is a more realistic estimation for a normal year. And even at that number, in a really heavy year, a big year, I think like the one we just got out of, we might still dip into contingency, but that shouldn't be reliably the case. And we now know, like I said, that budget was probably a little bit low to support our operations.
Okay.
Also takes care of our pit fees as well. So currently, we're dumping on night drives, so part of that is the disposal of the snow too. So they have dozers for us to push the snow. At times, they can hardly keep up this year. So part of that is there. So we were 90,000 this year just in the trucks, not to mention the pits.
Okay,
We compromised that.
my off-the-wall question. Have we ever thought about recycling all the gravel we put down?
It's been discussed. There's a lot of debris. There's, you'd have to sift it out, cigarette butts and different debris. It gets crushed down. You see this fine powder that's left out there now? As the traffic runs it over, the graders grade it, it breaks it down and, gets it pretty fine. We could definitely look more into it. It'd be a matter of, a piece of machinery to be able to sift out the garbage. You'd have to haul it somewhere, currently we, find areas in town to pit, bring it on site, and then filter it back out, and then go from there. Definitely look at it.
Or hose it down? All right, let's
Thank you.
move on.
Moving on next to building repair and maintenance. We've got really one full-time employee, our building maintenance technician. He supports a lot of projects around the city at all of our facilities. But there's several other folks who a portion of their time gets attributed to this department. And Melanie, for any highlights?
So the biggest highlight in this department relates to computer software. Siemens Insight software is what we currently use to control heating and ventilation systems in many of our city buildings. That software is seriously out of date and having issues. The current version that we're using is from 2011, and it needs to be updated. So this would include an amount in FY22 to upgrade that software.
Would we be installing that ourselves, or would that be,
IT department would work, yeah, through them, it's just a purchase fee, and then we go to Siemens, price with them, what the software costs.
Quick question on this. I see, was it contracted services? Assuming that's janitorial is in there? Is that correct? No. Does the city have their own janitorial staff, or do we contract that for all of our facilities?
It's a mix of both. So we do have a contract with some janitorial that serves City Hall, the library, and the police department.
And the streets department.
Would it make sense to maybe just increase our staff a little bit and hire a dedicated custodian for the city? I don't know if that's ever been looked at.
We've done that before.
We've done it before. It was fairly a wash. Challenge has been we end up is that we run such a minimal staff and that we don't have the redundancy like we talked about with the IT folks. We don't carry enough people to really have enough redundancy, and that's a bit of a challenge when we get people out.
Got it.
Cost benefit contract now versus what we get brought in return for that.
Andrew's crew also is tremendously helpful. They really stepped up over this last year when we were trying to follow the guidance as it was being created and shared in terms of sanitation and cleaning, and his crew were a regular appearance here at City Hall, at the library, et cetera, helping us keep up with that. So really appreciated how they stepped up and took on that extra responsibility. I think that's everything for building and maintenance. If you're, that kind of wraps up Scotty's departments, and we can move on to economic development and planning. John is out of town, but I told him we'd cover it, and if there were questions we couldn't answer, we would be happy to get back, follow up with him and get you answers tomorrow. But the economic development and planning department is 2 full-time employees. And really, there's not a lot to discuss in this budget other than increasing contracted services back to pre-COVID level of $10,000. Also budgeting for travel and training again in anticipation that that will resume in FY22. Okay, let's move on. Rachel's with us to talk about the library budget. I mentioned in my introduction a bit about some of the personnel changes that impacted the library department over the past year, but I know Rachel would be happy to speak to if there's any additional questions about that. So
in addition to the staffing, we did restore travel and training to pre-COVID levels, some material and supplies to pre-COVID levels, and also some periodicals that show up in dues and subscriptions that we had discontinued during COVID in an effort to reduce costs. Included in materials and supplies is an increase for electronic materials due to the significant increase in ebook circulation. And according to Rachel, ebooks in FY14 were about 3,661, and in FY20 they were over 23,000. So that has really ramped up, and so she has added an amount for that in materials and supplies. The other big increase is in the support and maintenance contracts, and that's for a few different items that were purchased with CARES Act funds. And this would be ongoing support and maintenance for those items, and those would be the self-checkout and curbside applications, the low-touch scanner, and the holds blockers that we implemented during COVID.
So COVID presented an opportunity to force us to think differently about how we deliver services, but with the CARES Act funding, we had also an initial upfront funding opportunity. And these are 3 of the projects that Rachel was able to implement where we knew there would be ongoing costs into the future, but she was able to put them in place so that they could kind of serve the community when we were under a more restrictive operating plan, but also people really like. And moving forward, we're able to just enhance the services at the library. Rachel, do you want to talk about any of those things? I think the materials and supplies budget would be interesting to hear about kind of your program for updating materials, but any additional stuff you want to share too? Thanks.
Yeah, so actually the increase was one that I had originally proposed for this year, and then of course the COVID uncertainty hit. The cost of books continues to rise, not significantly, but that was initially why I was interested in increasing those funds. And then, yes, ebooks continue to be very, very popular. We do pay into the Alaska Digital Library, so we get titles through the state. But then this money would allow us to provide additional titles that they're initially just for Soldotna cardholders. And then if there ever comes a point where our cardholders are not needing those titles, I have the ability to release those to the state system, and then they do the same for us. So it actually will improve services for our residents and possibly for other Alaskan residents too. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
I guess this question, I'm sorry, go ahead. I guess this would be directed to Stephanie. I see that under personal leave buyback for FY20, the library was significantly higher than I think every other department that I've seen that listed for. Does the city not have policies on establishing like a limit on amount of leave that you can cash out? So using my own experience as an example, at the school district, they cap how much you're able to cash out because they want their employees using that leave for their own mental health. It's good to be used. They just don't want people cashing all of it out. Does the city have something similar?
Yeah, a couple different things. So one is we actually require employees to use a certain amount of leave every year to make sure that they are taking some time, and I think that is a 40-hour requirement that folks have to use. The policy for cashing out personal leave, it has to be pre-designated in the prior year. So we and we do this for IRS reasons so that we don't need to treat it like taxable income as you earn it. So we put some restrictions around cashing it out, but the way that works is that you, by December 30th, I think, you have to send Jessica an email and let her know how much you're designating to be cashed out in the following year, and that's an irrevocable decision unless there's an emergency or something.
Got it.
So you pre-designate it, and you're allowed to cash out up to whatever you would earn. So if a person selected 100 hours, for example, they would be able to do that in that upcoming year by the time that they earn that. So that's how that policy works. There's not a hard cap in terms of what you can cash out other than what you could earn within a year and accrue, and you have to designate it ahead of time.
Okay.
So the other thing that impacts that line item is when an employee leaves employment with the city, then we would cash out all of their leave.
Got it. So if you have an employee leaving, there could be a significant expenditure there.
Closed out.
Vice Mayor Parker.
Thank you. Rachel, I just want to compliment you and all the folks at the library for your imagination and ingenuity this past year and a half as we've all struggled through issues. You guys have done a wonderful job, and the people of the city of Soldotna should be thankful that we've got such intelligent folks with great imagination and ingenuity at the library.
Thank you. I agree. We have an awesome team over there and an awesome community.
Going back to Mr. Chilson's question a little bit, on the personal leave, it's sick leave and vacation time all combined in one, is that correct?
Correct. The city used to provide two separate types of
Right.
leave, but years ago they were consolidated. So some people still have sick leave on the books if they had it at the time and didn't use it, but no one is earning sick leave now. It's just that single metric that's personal leave.
When they cash in, are they required to maintain a minimum level in case of illness? Meaning if you had 140 hours on the book, you have to keep 40 hours there just in case.
I believe that's the case,
That is
yes.
the case, but I can't remember what the dollar amount is. It might be 80 hours, I think, yeah.
So that's true of the cash out. You need to leave 80 hours if you're going to pre-designate and cash out personal leave. There's not a similar requirement to use leave. So people can use leave and their balance can get down pretty close. And those are more handled on a case-by-case discussion with folks, just maybe occasionally reminding them if there's someone who typically uses their leave without banking for an emergency type situation, we just encourage them to think through that when they're using leave. So if someone had 42 hours on the books, they could request to take 42 hours off. We don't require them to keep a minimum balance, but if they're cashing it out, we wouldn't let them cash out to zero.
Do we also have a maximum that you can only accumulate so many hours, and after that, you lose it or use it?
Some people know these rules very well.
Some people get close to that number and others don't ever, so. 720 hours.
And then I have one other question. These BizHub copiers, are we leasing these, purchasing them, or how that goes? Because it seems like there's an awful lot of them, and it's pretty high expense on them.
We are purchasing them. Discussed with our IT director whether there was a different model that might be preferable. Based on that conversation, he thought that we got more bang for our buck in just purchasing them outright versus the lifespan and what we would pay if we were renting them. Many of these we've probably had for a long time. We've been kind of just living with a lot of frustration, and this year felt like the year to make some upgrades in a few different departments. So those are the outright purchase, and then the ongoing support and maintenance contract would be separate.
Okay.
So the ones that are included in this year's budget are actually because they are not being supported anymore. So they've reached the end of their life, and the people we get the support and maintenance through have said they're not going to support it anymore. So we're kind of being forced to purchase new ones. We had included originally in the budget for City Hall, which you'll see in non-departmental, there was, and this is one of my typos that I'm fessing up to, we had included a BizHub replacement in FY22. We ended up having to do that earlier because we were having real big issues. And so we're doing that out of FY21, and I deleted it out of the budget, but the note still references it, so I will fix that.
Yeah, my experience with leasing them is you could buy two of them and it lasts twice as long as the one leased one would. So
Similar to, I think, what Bryce concluded.
I want to add one thing, maybe my question earlier is, when you do see these janitorial budgets, it also takes care of the toilet paper towels, so that whole number is not just for, so factor that in there, extreme amount of toilet paper substitute by so percentage.
Extreme.
Materials, so that lessens the amount that,
All right, thanks, Rachel. So moving on from the library, entering the Parks and Rec world. Next one is the Sports Center. And again, this is a place where many of our employees get allocated of their time into the different activities, whether it's at the Sports Center, whether it's parks generally, for example, supporting events at the Soldotna Creek Park, or campgrounds. Those are the three divisions where we'll divide people's time, and we show you the breakdown there on page 47. And moving into the detail sheets, starting on page 48.
So again, restoring pre-COVID levels for some staff training and adding some additional staff training. We did have a couple of one-time purchases, more maintenance related, like the Freon detector replacement and the amp replacement in the sound system. We did make some changes to the scheduling software in this department. What we purchased last year and started using fell short. And so we're switching, and so there's an increased cost in that that's located under support and maintenance contracts. This budget also includes the purchase of a replacement copier. I think that's the big highlights in this department.
Yep, and Andrew Carmichael's with us here, as well as our Assistant Parks Director, Joel Todd, and invite Andrew to share any additional comments.
In true form, sometimes I get in trouble for being cheap, but tried to bring forth a budget that was similar to the prior years, except for we were predominant within the budget is the replacement of funds. We dropped back and cut back in light of the COVID stuff last year, so we did cut a number of items and reduce them out of fear. Things materialized, and then we came back. We're within a couple percentage points over the course of the whole budget. In terms of almost flat versus I think Parks is actually down a little bit from last year. So we've added some stuff like doing the watering the flowers and trees and those things along the rights of ways and maintaining those. But we, over the course of the last year, Joel and I really dug in and broke down the staffing hours for the part-timers and those type of things for the summer and realized we could be more efficient. And so therefore, even though we've added those duties, we haven't added a financial nugget to that because we think we can do it for existing. We'll find out after the first of this 22 year, once we get all the downtown improvements in, what exactly the cost on those spaces are, and then go from there. There are some amounts that have been put in for the purchase of the baskets and those type of things. We do a lot of flowers inside in terms of those things, but overall we're fair pushed. But also the baskets, we get such a good price on that we hold those and still buy those locally. But Sports Center is Sports Center, and we're moving forward. We get the remodel coming next year. We shifted that back just because timing and everything else. In terms of those things, we're looking forward to a busy season where the phone is ringing off the hook, people wanting to book things and those type of things, and move forward into that. So,
Mr. Carey?
Just to the city manager, and Andrew just mentioned it, the remodel. Would this budget reflect what I'm hoping will be the possibility that we'll continue to put a good deal of money to bring this up to improve our sports center significantly?
Thank you. That funding would be probably a component of a capital budget. And so, as Andrew mentioned, I think I mentioned to the council maybe in my last city manager report, we were looking at the timing of putting out to bid this project. We were on a very aggressive schedule to get it fit in this summer. And when we recognized that the project budget was going to be heavily impacted by that timing, we're recommending we hold off on that. So this is the day-to-day operations, but a companion would be that capital funding, looking at more significant facility improvements.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Parker.
Thank you. So I do agree with pushing back on the upgrade to the sports center with the increased cost. And as I was reminded today, some of the problems with getting the equipment and the things we need has also been impacted because of the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And it's causing delays in getting things here. And specifically, the Birch Ridge Golf Course can't get golf clubs because of the problems that was caused with the delay, with the ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal for, 10 days. But the question, Andrew, so John sent us the upgrades that we're going to do along the Sterling and Kenai Spur right-of-ways. Is those costs reflected in this budget, or will that be FY23?
Cost to do them and add those items is within a capital project that we started 2 years ago and are finishing up this summer in terms of those things. Maintenance is included in here at this time. Breaking down the numbers, it looks like we can cover it with some money we had been leaving on the table. When in the prologue that Melanie provided, talked about, and Stephanie provided with the relation to rolling over budget, amounts where we start out the year what looks like it's deficit spending, but through efficiency and those things, we usually have a little bit of it. I'm deterred from saying buffer, but nonetheless, we usually come in under budget. Obviously, Sports Center probably not, with no revenue this past year. That was a kicker. But the maintenance costs and those are in this budget as well as for 22 and 23. We could revise it a little bit in 23. But right now, we're fairly confident that we can move forward with what we have to do those.
And just to piggyback on that, if you jump ahead to page 57 in the Parks Department, you'll see that we're budgeting increases for even things like materials and supplies. I was out at the Memorial Park, met with Joel and Andrew and Shelley last week, and even things like fertilizer for the expanded section of the Memorial Park. We're trying to think through to make sure that we can keep up in terms of maintenance and supplies and the labor needs of all the new, beautiful, additional things we're creating for the community. So part of the, like Andrew said, the labor, he's trying to keep a good eye on all the watering of the trees and the flower baskets and the new turf at the Memorial Park, but also things like making sure we just have sufficient supplies as we grow those services. I think we can let's move from the Sports Center, if there's no further questions, to page 53, campgrounds. And I'll ask Melanie maybe to cover any of the highlights from this division of the Parks Department.
Again, just restoring to pre-COVID levels for certain items. We did have a one-time purchase in there for an electric firewood bundler. I don't know if Andrew wants to talk a little bit about that. That's included in the small tools budget.
There's actually, you'll see two facets of that. Within the campgrounds, one of our revenue streams is from selling firewood from all the trees we cut down and remove and those type of things. We got hit with a big uh-oh or what the heck a few years ago when we found out that employees under 18 were not allowed to touch firewood in any capacity whether it's picking it up, bundling it, or touching it. Until it gets bundled and is put in the shed and becomes a retail item, federal law prevents anyone from 18 years or younger to touch it. It's left over from the late 50s, late 60s. Jessica, when we found this out, went all the way to the feds, and they said, yeah, it's left over from the forestry issue. You can imagine probably where the safety parameters were in the late 50s and those times. So it was a thing they put in. So that's kind of the bundler itself that's referenced is we have a manual bundler, but this is an electric bundler where we can have one person set the crate in, put the wood in, and then push the button and then go refill the other crate. So in terms of those things, we gross up to I think our peak on firewood sales is $10,000 a year. So in this year's budget, between this request for 45 for the bundler and then a wood processor that'll process 1.5 to 2 cords an hour, splitting down into that, then we should be able to recoup those revenues, because our biggest limiter on how much we sell in that line is actually that we keep running out. We cannot keep up. You'd think when the weather's yick, they would buy more, but no, on the best sunniest days is when you sell most of the firewood. So, and frankly, we have enough beetle kill to keep us busy for a while, but also that leads to nice dry wood that burns quick, and then they come and get back and get more. I will brag a little bit in that our bundles are about 30 or 40% bigger than what you see at most of the local vendors. We did that by intent and through the thing. So sometimes we'll set a commercial one from retail in town next to ours, and we do provide a good amount of firewood for the thing, but nonetheless go all through. So this cost will be recouped, as well as historically the way we staffed it prior to our little epiphany regarding the federal regulation was we would have the 15, 16, 17-year-old workers, booth workers, bundling firewood during the slow times. So you can imagine pulling those 5 bodies and the impromptu capacities out of it. It created a challenge to keep up. So that's where this one comes in within the campgrounds. Last year, you saw Alaska come down. We were 1% higher last year than the year before, even though the year before was down. So we saw a flat increase. People got out and about. Getting golf clubs, getting rental cars, getting anything recreational now is a challenge. because people have been scooping it up, and the silver lining to the pandemic has gotten people to go outside and really recreate, and we're enjoying that, but at the same token, working. Guys are busy, folks are busy.
Just a quick question. This might bleed into the Parks and Recreation budget, but I guess it could apply to campgrounds too. I didn't see any light items addressing replanting of trees as we go in and pull out most of those spruce bark beetle kill sites. Do we have budget included in there that's just not labeled for such for that?
Over the last few years, we've been the beneficiary from Kenai River Rotary does a planting every year. For instance, last year we pulled out 225 trees from Swiftwater, and they planted about 400 seedlings.
Okay.
We also working with the River Center right now, working with the permit with the River Center and the agencies. We've got some areas along Centennial and Swiftwater where the restoration worked so well that the trees are too thick and need to be thinned, and rather than go in and cut them and thin them, we have some equipment that we bought a number of years ago called an air spade, where we can go in and harvest those and transplant them so that we're not dealing with seedlings, we're dealing with small trees 5, 6, 7 feet tall. Our equipment allows us to pull those out bare root, having to work with the River Center because they're close to the river, but we've got an understanding that we're all can make that work, and we'll be trying to transplant as much as we can so that we end up with not only a visual impact and consistency, but also a higher survivor rate in terms of, for instance, the dog park. We could put 1,000 seedlings in there, and not a one of them is going to live in the dog park. Whereas we could bring in a whole bunch of trees, or a number, 15 or 20 or 30 from Centennial, recreate what we hope to have without the darkness that we have now, and then move forward and then have better survival rate and those type of things. So we're being creative in that, replacing those trees as we go. The sheer numbers, we're seeing growth come up. Once we open it up, then we'll see a lot of trees pop up. You'll see different characteristics within the birches amidst the gone spruce and those type of things. So we are working in those in ways we can without writing big checks.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Mayor Parker.
Thank you. So for our summer hires, the short-term laborers and campground attendant, do we reach out to employees who might have college or high school kids and ask them if they're interested, similar to the policy that the borough used to have? I don't know if they still do, where they look to hire employees' kids.
We don't explicitly kind of solicit that to employees, but I do know that we traditionally end up with a lot of employees' kids who come to work for us. Our one hard and fast rule is that those young people need to contact us themselves. So we tell employees, don't call HR on behalf of your 17-year-old, but if they're interested, we'd love for them to talk to us. Has that been accurate? We end up with a handful of...
Yeah, we ask that, we may, ask the employees, we're looking for people who will call themselves, not have mom or dad set it up, and that's one thing we make clear. For the most part, we get very few calls anymore. Years and years and years ago, we were getting bombarded all the time. Hey, old buddy, old pal, remember? No, it was never like that. But yeah, we do as much as we can. We don't necessarily provide a preference because but we do have that.
And in terms of just summer hires, we're very much right in the thick of it right now. Joel processes a lot of paperwork as they go through the hiring process. We bring on a lot of people in the summer, and a fair amount are returning employees. Can you guys talk a little bit about that? Who comes back year after year?
Yeah, we have a number of returnings, some rock stars coming back from last year. Some are off to college, some are going to college here, some are just coming and work for us for the summer and those type of things. Our peak, the most employees we ever had within our department one summer years ago was 45. But that was a little bit much, and it was odd in that what happened was everybody got all the time off they wanted for the summer because we had so many bodies, and then at the end of the summer they were like, wait a minute, I didn't make much. You played a lot, but I didn't make much. So we drop that down, and we work with the employees and lay out that, we'll keep you busy in June, but we need you here in July. And to carry over that, we carry as few as employees as we can, so everybody makes as much money as they can. We work with people as best we can on time off, and work forward through those things. So it's a bit of, I think we'll have a total of 34, counting our campground hosts this summer, that we work with and through in terms of those things. So we got bodies going pretty much almost everywhere, in lots of different directions.
Go ahead.
And are you having the challenges that you had last year with campground hosts?
Personalities come and personalities go. There's an effective tenure, so that after with those positions, we have we're not sure whether we have 2 sets of hosts that made it through the border, and then the other 2 are still working on getting through the border. So part of that is determined by Canadian border policies. It's odd in that we've traditionally had better luck with out-of-state folks versus Alaska folks, because Alaska folks got so much going on and so many different directions, whereas the other hosts, they don't need to leave. They're happy. They're in heaven once they get to the campground, and they don't go anywhere else. So tried a lot of different models, but for the most part, sometimes we'll get a very overtly aggressive or excitable or enthusiastic host that'll create some challenges that we got to attenuate down, and other times we got to build a fire and say we need to work up and step up a little bit. So it's a mix. Years ago we had a host couple in one of our locations that even none of the staff cared for, but they retrained the people in that area, and we haven't had problems there since. It's like it changed the whole personality, and there was a downside to that, but ultimately we had to bring in some policy enforcers, and then everything's been a lot easier since. Change of personalities and those cooperations. But it's always a balancing act when we have so many employees running around of all ages, from 16 to I can't say how old some of the hosts are, because they'd probably hit me. But so we got a wide range of people working together, and it's kind of cool.
Andrew, you said 16 and up. Is that correct for ages?
That's usually what we end up with. We've had a few 15 and a halves and 15s. What we find is the labor laws are it's not that we don't work around them or we don't. They're tough when you get the younger workers. For instance, we had a worker come to us years ago who had grown up on his dad's commercial fishing boat long lining in the Bering Sea, and then he gets back to work for us, and he couldn't stand on a 6-inch step stool because of restriction to protect him over those times. So.
The reason I ask is, we deal with young people at our business, particularly in the detail department, so you have a pressure washer, you have a vacuum cleaner or whatever, and we have got to the point where we do not hire anybody under 18 because of the labor laws, because of workers' comp. It's crazy. So I just don't know, what you're putting these kids doing, because you don't want to jeopardize the city.
We get a long list of restrictions and amendments with all the work permits. They essentially, a 16 to 17-year-old works in the booth and then will paint with latex paint and rake and do those type of things. We don't have them run any equipment, any power tools. They can run drills between 16 and 18. But under 16, it's problematic for the children trying to learn and get a job. But at the same token, over the years when safety wasn't paramount in the world, they created some situations we work around now. But it is a challenge. Over the years we've work there. But for the most part, we're able to. What happens is the younger workers will come, they'll work in the booth, we'll find out who's groovy and who's a real, and then they most of the time end up working as laborers inside the campground, administering the policies. We got 18, 19-year-old kids that are 4-year veterans in the campgrounds already, and they've seen it all. So when they get a line or a situation, chances are by the time they're 18, they've seen it all already and heard it, and so it's a real growing experience. We've had, I think, our longest tenure we had was one employee came back for 6 summers
Brock Cant is coming back for his 4th, I think, this summer, and we still get him for another one. So, it's when they go off to college and graduate, and you hope they don't get hired right after they graduate, so you can get one more summer out of them. We have a lot of those. We lost one who would have been a 4th-year veteran this summer, but he got a job in his field that works with his degree, so we couldn't hope for anything better than that, than to employ him and help pay for the school and then have them, and then lose them right mid-interview process because they got the job in their field to start working, so that's pretty exciting.
Well, I'd just like to say you do an incredible job with all, 13 parks if you count the sports center. It's an amazing job that you've done with your crew. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Just transitioning page 55 now to the Parks and Rec Department, and we can, I jumped ahead to this page earlier when we were talking about maintenance and budgeting for materials for some of the expanded beautification areas. Melanie, any other things to highlight in parks?
A couple of one-time purchases that Andrew, again, may want to elaborate on. Topsoil and seeding to expand the green space at Riverview Park. That's one of the things we identified in FY '22, as well as the base paths at Sunrise Park.
Riverview is a small little pocket park with just a little hole cut in the bushes for the playground equipment. What we're looking to do is push that back 50 or 60 feet towards Kobuk so we have some green space so people can get some sun and have a place to lounge and hang out as well. That's not the other option there. Grass, the only other grass there is right on in the right-of-way. So we're looking to do that. We're actually going to affect that this fall we're hosting the Alaska Recreation and Park Association Conference, and we're going to do a pre-conference workshop where Totem Equipment is going to bring in some equipment. We hope some other vendors bring in some equipment for turf management and rebuilding, and the professionals can view some of this equipment. And essentially, we'll get the equipment that we provided for free. Actually, they'll pay a sponsorship and go there, so we'll try out some new pieces of equipment and find out how it's most efficient. So Sunrise Park has traditionally just been a non-program space, and it's just a big field, and we're getting a lot of requests to create a softball field over there. Well, that could also be used by the kids, and just cut in the base strips because the Soldotna Little League has the guards there is very tightly because they're in such good shape, so they're not generally accessible. So this is to provide that area over at Sunrise Park to be ready for an impromptu soccer game, impromptu baseball, or impromptu kickball or softball to kind of expand what they can do with what people can do with the various areas. And part of that is also tied in with our capabilities. The prices are low because the council approved the purchase of a Ventrac piece of equipment, which actually has a sod cutter and all the attachments that allows us to do those type of things. So it's moving forward and pretty great.
Let's see. Also in this department, there is an increase to sanitation that we probably want to talk about, and that's for adding hand washing stations at Soldotna Creek Park during the summer and fall, portable toilets at Arc Lake during the winter time, and portable toilets at the dog park during the summer and fall. Those are new additions and increase the budget.
Quick question on that. My understanding is that we were isolating CARES funding outside of the biennial operating budget, and I assumed that those would be covered by CARES funding. I know we talked about allocating some CARES funding earlier for hand washing stations down at the park, and I'm just curious why those are in here now.
So
With
we
finance
have been
on that
using
stuff.
CARES funding for the rental of the hand washing stations, but that's going to be done at the end of the year, and so this would be going forward to
Got
be
it.
able to offer that going forward.
Ms. Hutchings?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Andrew, when you said baseball, in that park, there are apartment buildings and homes all around Sunrise. Is it going to be small children so we don't have somebody hit a home run and end up in somebody's living room?
Yeah, for the most part, with softball, the distances work within the softball and those type of things. Could be a challenge, but we do have the backstop there and work through those things. So it won't be something that you'll be attracting the high schools towards or anything else. And frankly, it'll be a basic, kind of almost like a glorified sandlot lane. So in terms of those things, so it's more of a recreational than a
Well, it'd be nice to see that park used more. I know that it's kind of forgotten, and it's such a great space.
Yes.
So thank you.
Vice Mayor Parker.
Thank you, Mayor Whitney. I used to use that park a lot back when I lived over on Arlington Court. Good place to go walk your dog. So we've talked about, and you've worked through the CARES Act. ARP, what do we know about that? Or do you want to save that till tomorrow?
You know, actually, we hadn't intended to kind of bring that as part of this discussion, but I'd be happy to gather some information and talk about that. We can try and do it tomorrow. Yeah. We have just that one little paragraph at the beginning in the narrative about the CARES Act, and it's not part of the discussion really because it's not represented anywhere in this budget, as Mr. Chilson said. It's a separate fund. And so it really, the only influence it has on this budget is in places where we used CARES Act money to help pay for expenses that have been previously identified in the budget. So we can look back now to FY19 actual, and in that May through June of 2020, that last piece of FY19, early on in the pandemic, when we used some CARES Act funding for police department payroll, for some of my payroll in the early days of standing up our emergency operations team, and when we were all fully devoted, it reduced our expenditures in those years. But other than that, it doesn't show up as any fund within this document because it's not an operating fund, it's a separate project. And that's why it's almost hasn't been mentioned part of the conversation today. But we'd be happy, we'll gather that information and share what we know in terms of the upcoming funding opportunity. And we can provide a little bit of update on that tomorrow. Thank you. Any other parks, final parks comments? Thank you, Andrew and Joel, both for being here. We are now at the very final piece of the discussion for today, non-departmental, which is the last department we wanted to cover. As part of today's agenda, non-departmental is a piece of this fund where we put kind of citywide expenses. So our legal fees are here, our audit fees are here. Audit fees are in finance. Thanks for correcting me, Melanie. Some of the contracts we have, for example, the visitor center contract with the chamber for them to administer our marketing and staff the visitor center is here. So it's just general expenses. I'll say a couple of things I wanted to point out. We did increase professional services. That's 43100. That's our legal fees. We actually cut them, I think, in prior years recently based on actual use. And so we lowered that budget amount. We're increasing it just slightly, not to where we were. And partly that's because our attorneys informed us of a small increase in their hourly fees. That increase is very reasonable. We haven't had an increase in a very long time. So they notified us of that. That'll have a small impact. The other is the appeals that they're working on. So Brooks Chandler and his office are on our behalf working through the appeal process of the annexation decision, and they will spend more time on that this year than we've had in prior years. But overall, for a city to have, I think, just over $71,000 in legal fees, we are very efficient. Our staff do a lot of homework, a lot of research in getting legislation or contracts or documents or agreements to a very good draft when we then bring in our attorneys to help with the final details. But there is a slight increase in that line item. Employee appreciation, that's a small budget, but I did ask for a little bit more funding this year, just bringing that to $7,500. That's partly to do just our once a year kind of employee appreciation party. It's also for things like retirements. The city had not budgeted, didn't really have a policy on kind of if an employee leaves, we, the city, would get them something small to commemorate their time. So I anticipate potentially being able to use this employee appreciation line item for things like that, as well as we might have fun programs or just encouraging challenges throughout the year. And this is a, as I mentioned, a small increase from, I think, 5,500 to 7,500 is what we're asking for. I'd ask Melanie to, let me touch on this before I move on. Remote seller sales tax collection fees. This is the fees that I was describing earlier as a portion of that revenue that's collected by AML staff on the commission and then remitted to us. Per generally accepted accounting principles, we need to report those fees separately as an expense. You want to elaborate on that?
Yes, so accounting standards require that we report the revenues at gross and then an offsetting expense. So this is new to this budget. It's also something that you're going to see in ordinance. I think the public hearing is at the next meeting to appropriate funds for the current fiscal year for the collection fees related to those revenues that have happened in 2021.
So the commission has been sending us monthly remitting the net of those, that revenue minus their fees, but according to what we now know, we need to report the gross amount and report the fees that we're paying to the commission, even though we will never cut a check for this. This is something that they take out of it prior to remitting those monthly returns back to the city. Melanie, I asked her to talk a little bit about insurance. So this is not our non-health care insurance. This is property, professional liability, everything else. Ask Melanie to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so our property insurance, our property values went up about 9.5% overall this year, and that's due to property appraisals that were done by our insurance company. In addition to those increase in property values, rates for property have increased substantially this year just due to natural disasters in the lower 48 and increased demand on and increased cost of building materials. So we did see a significant increase in property insurance costs. However, offsetting that, our workers' comp rates have decreased this year, as well as the general liability insurance that has also gone down. Previously, before we switched insurance companies, our old insurance company required the use of a broker, and that was included, the fees for the broker were included in our rates. When we switched a couple of years ago to the new insurance company, they no longer require, or they don't require the use of a broker. We kept the broker on just as we transitioned to the new plan, just to make sure everything went smoothly. But now that we're up and running, we feel like we don't need those broker services right now. And so therefore we eliminated that from the budget. So overall, it's a decrease to insurance line items. However, in certain departments, you will see an increase. So that will show up mainly in the airport budget and the utility budget. The broker fee, that was the reduction, lived solely in the non-departmental budget, where the property increases happened a lot in the utility budget and the airport budget due to the new shred building, the utility budget due to just the property appraisals, as well as the wastewater treatment improvement project that was recently completed. And so in those departments, you will see increases, but others you'll see decreases. And overall, across citywide, it is a decrease in insurance.
Was that a local broker?
It was previously Brown Agency, and then they were bought out by Hub. And so the person we'd been working with was a Hub employee.
Ms. Hutchings?
So on our workers' comp, are we self-insured or not? No?
No, we're not self-insured for any of our insurance.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Carey?
More of a general question to the manager. I very much support the idea of 2-year budgets, and obviously this is the beginning. Looking at fiscal year 23 as compared to fiscal year 22, in many of the budgets are almost identical. Would you anticipate that as we move forward, that there'll be more of a difference? We'll be looking at what in 2 years we expect as compared to one, or would you anticipate that that'll be very similar both years?
Thank you for that question. I think, honestly, it depends by the department, because we've got a lot of departments where you can very consistently budget, and you can assume that maybe for the next 5 years that this, these line items can be fairly constant. That would be true of most of our administrative type departments. I would say finance, planning, my department, et cetera. For departments where they do a lot of projects like parks or streets, you would expect more fluctuation, but I think a 2-year time horizon is still fairly reasonable to be able to have us planning those needs out 2 years at a time. The one area where I think the budget will change the most from year to year, and the one that we really have difficulty predicting in year 2, is that top piece of each department where it's payroll, salaries, health insurance, et cetera. So we don't have a very accurate way to project a year ahead what health insurance rates are going to do, for example, workers' comp. A lot of those things, we're notified of those changes, and we put them in the budget. So, but for those salary and benefits portions, we would address that during the middle of the 2-year period. So we'll come back to you next year with updated information on that. In terms of maintenance and operations, I think that you're seeing a lot of consistency between year 1 and 2, because historically there hasn't been much change in some of those departments. So I hope that is fairly accurate. I think we're going to learn a little bit through this process, but I don't think it was an oversight, for example, and it reflects actually what we think will just be consistent needs from year to year.
Excellent. What I would like to ask you to consider, about a year from now-ish, I'd be interested to hear from you the benefits of going 2-year versus when we were just single year.
Melanie is hoping there's a lot of benefits next year, because, so she will answer that honestly, and I will give you my take as well.
Well, we'll be honest, absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and particularly, again, one of my earliest motivations was, as I mentioned, the amount of time and just assembling these documents year to year, and that's something that we'll be paying close attention to next spring.
Vice Mayor?
So have you heard, what do the departments think about a 2-year versus a 1-year? Is it more beneficial to the departments to have the 2?
I'd be happy to just let folks kind of share thoughts on that.
2 instead of 1. Economy by scale. So technically, extra work on the front end, and then hopefully it saves some,
Challenge would be price changes, steel going through the roof, wood's going through the roof, so there will be some challenges, like Stephanie said, address some of the issues midway through. I'm a little scared in some areas of equipment, and stuff's changing so rapidly right now. I told them earlier, we ordered some sweeper parts, and we would order them, they were $4,200, and we ordered them a week later, they were $7,000 a sweeper parts. So there will be some uncertainty, but I think there is a chance to come back in a year and adjust some of the numbers. So I think the biggest challenge would be, equipment 2 years out, but there is a chance to adjust that. What's the price of freight are going to be 2 years from now versus just budget projected. So, yeah, I think we need to have sort of development, and it's a little more work up front, but the benefit will be next year.
Any other questions from the council?
For departments like mine, the mayor and council budget and the clerk's budget, we don't have a lot of projects. There's not a lot of variation from our budget year to year, so it was not that hard to assemble. It's looking at where travel's going, and it was actually a very nice process for me.
The last thing I'll mention is at the end of the non-departmental budget, we're at the end of today's agenda, but what we did insert in this budget is the specific requests from the 4 nonprofit organizations. So we plugged into this budget document what they requested. 2 of them had a slight increase from prior year requests, but what they requested is what's built into this budget, and we'll start off tomorrow at 2 o'clock with each of those entities being able to present directly to you about their requests and their programs. And then after they present, so we'll start back where we left off in non-departmental, and then afterwards, after they present, we'll move into the other non-general fund. And I think tomorrow's work session will be much shorter. We've got much less ground to cover.
We did the agenda a while ago, but I believe it's 10 minutes, and then there's, then whatever time the council has for questions and answers.
Anything else? Well, that will end this work session and come back at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Same time, same place, same channel.